Hi everyone, here we are with Sondra Abanto. She is the Performance Management Specialist, and we're doing the Wisdom Share with Sondra series. This is our second in the series, and Sondra's joining us here tonight to talk about performance management. So please welcome Sondra. She's worked in both the civilian sector and the federal sector, from the National Institute of Health to Navy and Army, working in performance management. She's a performance management analyst, and I first met her 5 years ago this December. So
yes.
Yeah, so we're both military spouses. We both happen to be back in the same area again and taking advantage of this opportunity to interview Sondra. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
All right. So can you tell us a little bit about performance management?
Sure. So basically, we touched on this in the previous session, but performance management is everything from everything from once you're on board, setting the stage for how you're going to perform. And so typically that is a composition of programs that work together, like your PD review and execution of your position description.
So PD, position description.
Position description.
Okay.
I'm trying not to go into acronym mode. So you'll have your position description, and that's basically going to enumerate what you are to do on the job and how much of your time is spent on those particular activities. Again, that happens in the civilian sector of government. It happens in non-federal companies in the private sector. And so you'll see just kind of a rundown of what you're going to do, how much time. You also have your performance plan.
Okay.
And that should be linked together, woven together with your position description. So basically, your position description tells your boss, tells your colleagues what you're going to do. And then your performance plan actually says, okay, you're going to do all these things, and then we're going to measure you and how successful you were on doing the things that are in your position description. Also, you'll have an individual development plan, ideally, or a learning plan. And that basically says, these are the types of courses that you want to take in the short term, midterm, and long term. And again, that's going to be hopefully woven in with your performance plan and your position description. So those are going to work. Those three are going to work together. And then on a time frame that's determined already, either by company policy or government policy or agency policy or corporate policy, you will know how often you're going to sit down and discuss your position description, how often you're going to discuss your individual development plan, and then how often you're going to discuss your performance plan. So all of those things should be in a natural cycle. It should be well defined. And so there should never be a surprise about when you're going to make revisions to the position description if required, how often you're going to do a performance plan revision, and then have a sit down with your supervisor or a board or a panel to do your semi-annual review, quarterly review, annual review, and then also your individual development plan or your learning plan. How often is that expected to be updated? So all of these things together comprise performance management.
Okay, so as a new employee, it's my position description, which tells me a little bit about what's expected of me, and then my immediate supervisor and probably the clinic director as well. Right. And then tied to that, I should be expected to have something called a performance plan, which is tied into my employee evaluations.
Yes. So and oftentimes your performance plan is your framework for your evaluation. Okay. So they'll even use that same performance plan document at some organizations in the government to evaluate you and score you, or they may use that in conjunction with a separate scoring template, and that's how you're evaluated by your boss or a panel, depending on how your organization's set up.
So depending on how my organization is set up and what kind of job I have, I'm either being evaluated by my immediate supervisor, or by a panel if it's a unique job.
There's different reasons for using a panel versus just your supervisor. And also for the federal government, oftentimes you'll have your immediate supervisor, and then you'll have your higher reviewer. So it might be your supervisor or clinic director. And so basically the input that you provide and that your supervisor provides is fed to that person, and they will pretty much say, okay, I agree with what the supervisor said, or let me make some notes of my own, and they'll communicate that. And that feedback may be adjusted, and it may not be shared with you.
Okay.
But there's some back and forth that may go on with the supervisor and with the second supervisor, to basically say, okay, I think this person did really well here, and maybe this is something they need to look at. They'll come to an agreement, and then they'll provide a score, and then you'll have your sit down with them and discuss it. Other scenarios or situations in which there may be a board, if you have a limited number of positions that allow for advancement. So, for example, in the government world, or on the contracting side, or in a corporate side, you maybe have 5 acupuncturists, but then there's only 3 acupuncturists that can advance to the next level. And so a board, in order to ensure parity and try to eliminate favoritism, they may use a board where your immediate supervisor is not party in that decision-making process. So they can give their input, maybe they don't, but basically a panel is going to go over and review everything in your write-up. That panel will have a vote. So kind of similar to an interview panel, they'll have a vote and they'll say, okay, based on the scores, and we're going to move these 3 acupuncturists forward, and now they're going to be GS-13s.
Okay. I think as a military wife, as the wife of a Navy chief, I'm familiar with that, with something called selection board.
Yes.
So when someone becomes a chief, they go, when it's time to be promoted, they go through a selection board process on an annual basis, because they can only promote so many people, and it's a very complicated thing that goes into that. But all the evaluations with their immediate supervisors throughout their time of service get to be part of that data pool. But there's other parts of data that they also pull from.
Exactly.
Kind of what you're...
Exactly. And again, it really depends on your agency. It depends on your private sector organization. They will have a guideline or some type of SOPs or something that tells you this is how
SOP is standard operating procedure.
Trying so hard not to just go into acronym phase. So your organization will say in black and white how they do advancement or how they do annual reviews, and then that will determine whether or not you're going to go through a board, or if it's just your supervisor, or if it's your supervisor and a second supervisor.
Okay, like the clinic director.
Correct. Yes.
So, okay. So, and this is, so you should know when you're going to be evaluated. And it might be quarterly, it might be twice a year. And then isn't there like a process? So in an ideal situation, you'd have these quarterly reviews, and then an annual review.
Yes.
So that the quarterly reviews kind of move up into the annual review. So you don't have as much of a surprise all at once at the end of the year. You've been working on something throughout the year.
If everything is working the way it should never be a surprise what you're going to score or how you'll be evaluated for your final. So typically what will happen is you'll have I don't want to say operational tempo. You'll have a set schedule. And so you'll know you're going to have a midpoint review, and then you'll have an annual review, or you're going to have quarterly reviews and an annual review. That'll be stipulated. Normally that's within the performance plan documentation or the standard operating procedures. And so you'll meet with your supervisor. You'll also know how feedback is expected, because oftentimes you're expected to provide feedback to your performance plan, and your supervisor is looking for that, and the program encourages that. But regardless of how the feedback is done, or if it solely relies on the supervisor, there's a set schedule. And so when you sit down at your midterm, you should have a very fair understanding of how you've performed up into that midpoint review. And then there should be an idea as if you continue on this trajectory, you're going to meet your goals, or you're going to have trouble, or something needs to be tweaked. And that's the time where you really want to have this conversation with your supervisor. How am I doing? How can I improve? Is there anything I really need to work on? And how do you perceive this? And that's hopefully will be a good, frank, positive, beneficial conversation.
So your performance plan shouldn't be something that is in the stars. Like it should be something that's practical, that you can actually meet.
Yes.
So can you give me some examples of what that might look like?
So typically in your performance plan, again, depending on the organization, they may look at your position description and say, okay, you're expected to see patients in a clinic. And maybe that's going to be 40% of your time or 50% of your time. So on your performance plan, you should have a performance element, and it should be one of 3 to 5 elements that says, okay, we expect you to see patients at the clinic, and as a metric, as a measure of this, we expect you to see, unless there's unusual circumstances, let's say we want you to see 5 patients a day. And so if you don't make it to 5 patients a day, that's a conversation you should be having with your supervisor before you ever get to your midpoint. So if you're able to see 10, if you're able to see 2, you should be sitting down with your supervisor and saying, 5 is really too low, or, I could only do 2 because our systems are down all the time. But there should be some discussion about why that's a realistic number. And so we talk about having SMART metrics. And basically it's, what SMART metrics is it specific? Is it measurable? Is it something that's attainable? Is it realistic? And is it timely? So for example, you're not going to be graded on how many patients you saw for 2016 if it's a 2018 review. That has, what you did in 2016 should have anything to do with what you did in 2018 in terms of your metrics measurement. And so that helps.
Oh, because of the time based.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. So, and then something attainable. So for example, if your supervisor puts down that you should be seeing 30 patients a day, that's in an 8-hour day, that's not realistic.
And you're seeing patients for 1 hour at a time. They don't have 30 hours in a day.
No.
Or 15 hours in a day.
And so
assuming an 8-hour day.
Right.
With lunch breaks and all that.
With lunch breaks, with, hopefully 2 15-minute breaks, 1 in the morning, 1 in the afternoon.
In time to do notes.
So,
I mean, we're just doing hypothetical. We're not saying you should see a certain number of patients in a day. It's just giving hypothetical examples. But what I often find is for say a 5-day work week, I'd rather have a patient goal for the week versus a patient goal for the day. So if they say you need to see 8 patients a day, and then I have a Thursday, let's say I'm supposed to be in all these different meetings on a Thursday, and I have 2 hours of clinic time, and oh, Megan, you haven't met your clinical goal of seeing 8 patients on that Thursday, and I'd be like, well, that's just an impossibility, based on these things. So let's, instead of making that per day, I want to make that an average per week. And now my math in my head isn't. Say I want to averaging 25 patients a week.
Right.
And so that's something that you can exceed, without being penalized. So if you're getting lots of cancellations in the clinic for some reason that's out of your control, that's something that you have to go back to your supervisor about, hey, these patients keep canceling out. How do we, I'm not able to see my patients, not because I'm not available, but because they're just not showing up, or they're, cancellations or no-shows. So how do we fill that? And then that would probably go back to the clinic director and be a issue in that way. But
so there's multiple challenges in that scenario you just gave. And so if it's realistic for you to see and be measured on patients per week instead of daily, that has to be something that's communicated to your supervisor with something like that explanation. If you think about the charting I have to do, if you think about mandatory training, let's say your organization says Thursday's training stand down, then you have to,
hey, welcome, Diane.
So basically you want to have that conversation with your supervisor and say, I think it's more appropriate that we have our averages be by week instead of a daily average. And they may say, you know what, that makes total sense. Let me just do an average for the week, or I might even do a daily average, but I know that I'm going to exclude Thursday from the calculation. And that's part of your write-up. I'm
sorry, I have background music playing that I forgot to.
It was very soothing.
Okay.
So basically, again, being realistic, you want to look at these types of factors and then give feedback to your supervisor why this makes sense or why we might need to tweak that. And so doing an average per week may make more practical sense than sticking to a black and white goal every single day when there's things that are out of your control. And then when you do, typically what will happen is you'll have your performance plan and then you'll have this feedback mechanism, or it may be just solely your supervisor writing the feedback. But as you're having these discussions, those are being documented. So if I were to write up my self-evaluation, and if I was able to exceed the average, I want to state in black and white, I exceeded the average, and by how much. I also want to state, if there were some extenuating circumstances, like we had a training stand down for patient safety. And so everybody had to stop seeing patients and all we did was work on training. I'm going to note that because it's going to affect my average. And I don't want that to look negative. There was a purpose or a reason why we weren't able to achieve our average, and that's well documented. So you can't be dinged for that on your performance.
Okay. So is there a way as a so this is all being written. If there's something that comes up in my employee evaluation and that my supervisor has written down and I completely disagree.
Right.
Is there I would like to be able to write down what it is that I disagree about, and then would that become part of my record for that?
Yeah, and there's several ways to do that. So for example, if you have the opportunity to have a back and forth discussion with your supervisor before you start doing the final midterm or the final midpoint review or the final review, then you can have that discussion. And oftentimes, hey, supervisors are human. They forget things. They may even cut and paste from another employee's plan, which happens all the time. You may be referred to by the wrong name or the wrong gender. When you look at the write-up, it's happened. It's happened to me on several occasions where I've been called a he, and my name is Bob, and so it was like, I think they may have cut and pasted that from another management analyst. So basically, that's your opportunity to try to get those things corrected. If it's not, you can speak with, if you don't make any headway with your supervisor, then you can engage labor or employee relations or human resources at your organization if it's a non-government entity. So private sector, you can go to your HR specialist and say, look, I have some serious concerns about the way this was presented. You can present information, and then according to their policy, they may do something like mediation, or they may have a talk with a supervisor. And who knows? So, they have something documented that says this is how we'll handle a situation where somebody's write-up is drastically different from what the supervisor is reporting on a specific performance element or all across the board. With the federal government, you can basically provide your own write-up, and you can also talk to your supervisor. If you don't get any resolution, you can go to their supervisor. And we talked about chain of command in the previous session, where you have the ability to go to the supervisor above your supervisor if you don't get resolution, or you can talk to HR or an EEO specialist and bring your concerns forth.
Equal
Employment Opportunity Specialist. So they basically will assist you if you feel as if you're being treated differently because of your race, your gender, your age, any of those government-defined categories that the Equal Employment Office covers. Okay. So you can Google EEO.gov.
EEO, okay.
Probably EEO.gov.
Sure I heard that. Okay, and so we talked about SMART metrics. So sometimes, the main thing in that performance plan as an employee is like, I really want to know how I'm being measured.
Right.
And then how does that measurement play? So in an ideal situation, the way I'm being measured should play into my position description and the clinic mission and the hospital mission, right? In other words, you shouldn't be doing things that don't have anything to do with your clinic mission or your hospital mission, unless it's a collateral duty, it's a volunteer opportunity, or it's something that's well-defined and documented. So for example, if you work for a corporation and they're very big on volunteer time, and maybe they'll give you 10 hours a month to volunteer, your performance plan should reflect that, because you're going to be available less time for your normal core duties because you have sanctioned volunteer work that's being done, and you want to make sure that's documented as well. And so everything should be clear. It should be accounted for. You should know how you're being measured. There should never be a question about what is being measured, how it's being measured, how it's being calculated, so that there's no gray areas, or you minimize the gray areas. Minimize the gray areas. Okay. And then, so sometimes in clinics, so as clinicians, in general, metrics is always this complicated thing. Right. Because we have this what's called the old model. Right. It's really not that old. It's really not a horrible system, but it's based on patient load and
Mhm.
RVU count.
Right.
That's the previous model. And then the new model is the value-based outcome measures.
Right.
And so most clinics are actually a hybrid of both. They're collecting clinical outcomes and patient-centered measures and patient-reported outcomes, and then sometimes that's even just a patient satisfaction survey. So they're doing that, but then they're also measuring you by your RVUs and your patient load. And even if you're not technically measured by that, they're still collecting that information. So it's interesting as a clinician to kind of know how I'm being measured. And so sometimes you have to talk to your supervisor and or your clinic director, because as an integrative health, integrative medicine, depending on what funding you're operating out of, you should always be measuring something.
Correct.
Even whichever it is, you should be measuring something. You shouldn't be measuring nothing, because you always, at some point in time, those directors have to go back to hospital admin and validate why they've had the space and this resources that they've been spending. So have to be measuring something, even if it's patient satisfaction scores, measure something. So so I guess as a clinician, I'm on a little soapbox, I guess, but being measured by RVUs versus and patient load versus clinical outcomes, and kind of often being measured by both, and trying to figure out how that's going to fit into the mission. So, but always kind of checking back in with our supervisor and clinic director, right? Okay.
So just,
sorry.
Okay. That was a lot.
Yeah.
So, coming from the resource management, and the government, we call the budget office the resource management office. And having worked in a resource management office, we have a very different perspective than you as a clinician.
Okay.
Because I have to make sure that there's enough money to pay the employees. I have to make sure there's enough money to keep the lights on, all of these things. And so I'm looking for, if I take off my performance management hat for a minute and put on my resource management hat, I have to think, okay, as a resource manager, how do I ensure that we don't go through our money after 6 months when it's budgeted for a full year or a full fiscal year? And so using metrics like RVUs or some type of tangible patient outcomes allows me to justify getting more money the next fiscal year, or saying, ooh, we kind of blew through a lot of money, we're going to have to clamp down, because really, if we're seeing this many patients, then we should have these types of RVUs. So you always have these competing, related but competing agendas between the resource managers and the clinicians. And if we could have an opportunity to give the clinicians all the time that they could have to see patients, and all the time to chart and do all these things without having constraints, then we probably wouldn't have to have RVU measures. But because we do, that's our best guess, and that's our methodology for how do we calculate when the money is going to run out for our clinic. And so sometimes in our exuberance to make sure that we're keeping the business running, we forget about those clinical things that are deal breakers or that are not realistic or attainable. And so you have the clinic type metrics, and then you have the individual performance metrics. And again, those should still be related.
Employee, when you say individual, you're talking about individual employee, not
right. Your individual. So for example, for you as an acupuncturist, you're going to have your metrics and your performance plan. But then at the clinic level, as a resource manager, I'm going to have metrics that I look at from a clinic perspective, and how effective are you and your colleagues in running your clinic and seeing your patients and having positive outcomes. And then on top of that, say you work for the Army or the Navy, or if you're a non-government, then how are we doing at an enterprise level with some of our key performance indicators? And so it's these different levels of metrics depending on where you're at in the organization. And are you talking about clinic metrics? Are you talking about performance plan metrics? Are you talking about, resource metrics? So there's, it could be a never-ending discussion, but all of these things are competing. But again, the focus is having everything integrated and taking care of the patients and being able to pay the bills and keep the lights on. That's that delicate balance between all of those.
So as a clinician, my performance plan as an employee fits into all these metrics as I'm a puzzle piece in the bigger puzzle. So somehow my performance plan in my position description have to, if I'm doing my job well and meeting standards, it should help keep everything running. So as a clinician, that's where I'm at. But as someone who's a program manager is going to have to look at, like, well, how are all my employees meeting their performance plans, and how am I meeting what the hospital admin is asking me to do from a resource management perspective? And do I need to, how many research studies or research grants do I need to spend time writing those grant proposals for work that we're doing, so we can get some of those, PCORI grants, or try to apply for federal funding to have that, yet another way of having income coming into the clinic.
And that may be a performance metric. Like, if you come on board and you're an acupuncturist, I expect you to contribute to the writing of at least one grant proposal.
And then I could get time for that.
And then you could get time. And again, that could be a collateral duty. So it may not be part of your typical 100% of your duties that are in your position description. But we carve out 10, 20, 30% and say, okay, you're going to devote this time. And then your patient load should also be reduced so that everything is comparable to you having a reduced patient load, because you're only at 70% or 80% versus another acupuncturist that's not doing any type of proposal writing.
And is like doing 100% clinical. So I kind of, when I hear I'm a 100% clinical, that always kind of like, oh, but we have to do a little bit of training, facility training. So maybe you're 95% clinical.
Right. And in the real world, you're never going to be 100% in the clinic. I mean, you still have your admin duties, you still have training, you still have mandatory training. But just giving the round example of 100% of your time, if you just take 20% out because you're going to do a collateral duty like grant writing or grant proposal writing, then that obviously is going to impact how many patients you can see in the real world.
Well, I think it's even more common for acupuncturists in hospital practice to be tasked with not just clinical work, but also going out and doing talks, just training in services. So like talking about how acupuncture and what they do as a practitioner of acupuncture and East Asian medicine fits into like say rheumatology. Like, hey, for acupuncture works really well for these rheumatological conditions. This is how you can refer to us. I'm talking about a couple studies, and then so having time actually written into my performance plan to do that, so that it's not technically volunteer work. Like, I have to do it to get patients in, unless my clinic director is actually actively recruiting patients to the clinic. But to be able to get good flow and get people referring and having that patient demand, other departments need to know what it is that we do. So having, ideally, that be written into my performance plan.
Critical. And it should also be potentially written into your position description too, especially, for example, you may come on board as an acupuncturist and then your supervisor finds out that you're really gifted at community outreach and at in-services and liaison between traditional medicine and traditional Chinese medicine. And so your position description and your performance plan should evolve as your role evolves. You never want to be selling yourself short because you didn't include that in your performance plan and it wasn't included in your position description. That should be part of it. And then perhaps the next year, it may be even more. So it may take over more of your time so that you're doing 50% outreach, community events, in services, lectures, things of that nature. And so that constantly has to be updated in your, we often say living documents, but a position description and your performance plan, I wouldn't say they're so elastic that they're going to change every month, but it's definitely plausible for them to change, once a year, twice a year, who knows,
but it's important to document what it is that you're actually doing, instead of going back to that original position description and be like, well, I actually do way more than my position description says. It's the performance plan document, or performance management document that goes with your employee evaluation that's going to be updating as time goes on. And
here's another selfish reason why you want to do that. When you go to apply for another position that's a higher grade in the government, or if it's in the corporate, maybe you want to get more pay and have a different title. Let's say you want to become the acupuncture clinical manager. And so you want to have everything documented, because if you don't, you look exactly the same as your peer that did none of that outreach and none of those in-services and none of that lecturing.
Okay.
And so you will be much more competitive. And if you work for the government, it's oftentimes with a job, it's required that you include your last 1 or 2 performance plans and what you were scored. And so that can help qualify you for a higher graded position. They can see clearly that you have that experience and expertise.
Well, I learned a lot of new things about performance plans tonight. So we're getting close to our time. If you guys have any questions out there, feel free to write in the comments notes. Is there anything else you want to talk about before we
I'm just peeking at our super duper outline. Real quick, are multiple people on the same performance plan? Yes, and that's oftentimes why you have a board.
Oh, so slow down. Are multiple people on the same performance plan?
Okay. So you may have the same template for acupuncturists, and you may have all your GS-12 or GS-13 acupuncturists on an identical plan.
When she says GS, it's government service, and that it's related to your position description and your education level and your responsibility and how much you get paid.
Right. So for example, there may be 10 acupuncturists in the clinic and you're all on the same base performance plan. If you have something like that collateral duty, then obviously that performance plan is going to be tweaked. But basically, all the acupuncturists are going to be held against that standard, and that's in their performance plan. And so if you don't document things like doing outreach and doing other things, and I see that your metrics don't align with your peers, that's going to be problematic, because I'm going to say, ooh, well, the standard is such and such. I don't see that this position description or this performance plan was tweaked. Seems like this person might have had a collateral duty, but that becomes important. And then again, if there's a board for promotion, or sometimes even when they're administering bonuses, if there's money to give out for high performance, then a board may have to convene and say, okay, well, this person did above and beyond their peers. So these are really kind of important things when you're talking about performance and then awarding performance.
Making sure it's your extra stuff is being documented.
Correct.
Okay. All right, great. Okay, we'll give a couple more minutes if you guys have any questions. Diane says, is there a sample performance plan available?
There should be. If you Google Office of Personnel Management or National Institutes of Health, you should be able to see a sample performance plan and tons of other resources, position descriptions. A lot of people will post them, whether they should or not, a blank one. But yeah, that should be a great way. Just Google it, and typically they'll have a performance plan listed up there. Also, there's a lot of forums on Facebook, different federal job forums, and they may have samples that don't have any sensitive information. It's just a template, and
de-identified information.
Correct. Yeah, or it might just be a total blank one, so you can take a look at that.
So it just shows like the boxes and the questions.
Right, exactly. Also, if you Google Total Army Performance Evaluation System, that's now defunct. It's been rolled into DoD. Now has everybody on the same performance plan and performance cycle. But the Total Army Performance Evaluation System was a precursor to the DoD one. There should be a lot of resources and manuals on that as well that give you an idea of how they calculate performance, how many metrics you should have per performance bullet, how many bullets you should, it goes into lots of detail.
You know a lot.
More than you probably ever wanted.
Well, thank you very much, Sondra.
You're
really
welcome.
Appreciate your time, and I learned a lot more about performance plans tonight and how that ties in. So, and then we have on our outline, we have a few other things we're going to talk about in future sessions, like career mapping and mentorship and teamwork. We could talk forever about teamwork.
I could talk forever, period, but she only gives me 30 minutes to 45.
So thank you very much, Sondra, and we'll be back in January. So thank you all. If you guys are watching this after it's been live, please keep putting your questions in there. Sondra is in our group, so she or I can get the questions to her, and we can get you some answers. All right. Thank you.